Okay, that's all I
Thanks
got.
very much. Superb presentation. Thanks very much, Dr. Richards. And thank you to all of the participants for all these tremendous questions. I think we recognize that in the time frame that we have, we're going to try to do some consolidation of your questions. But Tim, the first one that's coming through is very much along the lines of, what is the future of global supply chains versus that local production? I know you've touched on this in a few pieces of your presentation, but do you have any thoughts around right from production all the way through to some of the other pieces? And the second question is going to be about what citizen choices are making, but let's just talk about your views of global supply chains versus local production.
Right, right. Yeah, that's an excellent question. And I think my answer is going to be suitably evasive, because I think it's going to the general theme of what I'm seeing is that we're going back to normal to an extent where everybody's saying that it's going to be a different world coming out of this. What we're seeing in terms of fruit and vegetable value chains is that firms are going back to a relatively normal situation. Despite what we hear in the United States of, retrenching and United States first and things like that, I just finished a manuscript on global value chains with respect to fruit and vegetable industry, looking at the expansion of retailing in developing countries and things. And I think, that horse has left the shed. We're not going to put the movement toward global value chains back in just because of, a crisis like this and maybe a particular administration in the United States viewpoint on it and how that's working. Private money, private capital in the US and elsewhere, it gets ahead of what governments are doing. And they are, I don't think the COVID crisis is going to impact that. There's going to be material changes for, in the medium term, 4 to 6 months, don't get me wrong. But if we look, 2 to 5 years out, there is a freight train of development, evolution going on in global value chains, spurred on by retailing, that we're not going to get in front of, and there is a lot of private capital that's going to make that happen. Well, I think you're muted there, Stan.
Stan, can you unmute?
Yes, I had the same unmute automatic. Second question is sort of the inverse of this. Citizen behavior. I sometimes try to stay away from the word consumer, but how are citizens going to think about local production, online purchases, organic production?
Right.
What are your views about what's the delta in how citizens are going to respond to COVID?
Yeah, excellent question. And that's the nature of as I mentioned, the meeting that I'm going to have as soon as the seminar is done with this, it's a platform in North Carolina. They are responding to exactly that movement. In the United States, as in Canada, I had a grant a couple of years ago from USDA to look at local food markets. And that's exactly what we're seeing, is that this is really going to pour a lot of gas on the fire for, local food hubs, local platforms like the University of Illinois Market Maker that I suggested before. It's really going to give a kick to the whole CSA movement, community supported ag. Once we have, relaxing social distancing, people are going to move back to the farmers market sort of movement as well. Again, that's one of those sort of mega trends that we're not going to be able to get in front of. And this is really going to give it a shot. People are looking for, I talked about the analogy between the US and Canadian banking systems. I talk about resiliency in terms of large firms recognizing this real option notion that I was talking about. Didn't get a chance to talk about the other side of that, and that is a distributed supply chain system that we're seeing. And distributed supply chain means exactly these local platforms that we're talking about. People are going to move to these small sort of sources for food from a citizen consumer perspective, or from a market supply chain perspective from a grower. Why should I commit to a large retailer when I have a local outlet that's likely to be more resilient, likely to be a lesser costly way for me to get my produce to that sort of market? That is definitely going to be an important dynamic going forward. And I think this is going to give it a shot, just like it did for online retailing, or it's doing actually.
We're going to do 2 or 3 quick hitters here to see whether you have any background knowledge. Any views of how this is going to influence the meal kit industry? I'm assuming this is all of those usual groups that generally advertise on podcasts. How will this affect them in the future?
Meal kit industry. And so that could be any one of a number of things, like
I
food
guess
box
I suspect
industry.
that what the person was implying was indeed, and my goodness, now any of the company names are escaping my mind, but where the box shows up at your door with all the ingredients and you cook
Gotcha.
the meal.
Gotcha. Okay. Well, there's several different again manifestations of that. I guess we did some work with a company called at the time it was called Imperfect Produce a couple of years ago. It was basically that it was a box of produce that would show up on your doorstep. But the thing about Imperfect Produce was that they took ugly produce, that would otherwise not get into food service or retail value chains, um, and they would go not really glean it. They would get it from the farmer who would ship all of his seconds to this Imperfect Produce. They'd box it up. It was a subscription-based service, so they drop it on your doorstep. And you would, there was heart-shaped kiwis and, misshapen carrots, interlocked, this kind of thing. At the time, they were a startup. We had every transaction, our data set consisted of every transaction they'd ever done from when they started in early 2016 through like mid 2017. And our job was to show whether or not this was it's a two-sided demand kind of platform system, whether or not that would be viable. So we published the article in the Food Policy, and it won the Elsevier Publishing Atlas Award for 2018 as the article most likely to change the world, for what that's worth. But at any rate,
Wow.
so we got a nifty little trophy for it. Thank the CEO Ben Chesler for his data kind of thing, and he is now exploding. Coast to coast, he is in like 20 some different cities. It's called Imperfect Foods now, because they don't just do meal kits for produce. It's everything. Every kind of surplus food that they can get their hands on, they put in these boxes, and they are absolutely killing it. So he's the archetypical sort of millennial, capitalist entrepreneur, phone in each hand kind of thing. So he's hard to corral at the best of times, but he's just going crazy. He's a busy guy. He's a great entrepreneur, but you look at that, and again, back to the theme of private capital chasing good ideas. I think that's case in point. If there is a $20 bill laying on the ground, somebody's going to pick it up. And that's exactly what the surplus food market is doing. And there's Imperfect Foods is just one example. There's dozens of them out there that are doing exactly the same thing.
Thanks for that reminder. And thank you for the person that reminded me of Blue Apron. I would just say that a man in my advancing years, my memory starts to fade away after a while. I'm sure there were hundreds of you thinking I need to type in Blue Apron or many of the other companies. So thank you all. Here's a fairly specific one, but one that I would be interested in hearing your understanding of the data. Where do producers of vegetables and fruits make the most money? Is it sales into food service or into the retail market?
That is an awesome question, and that I don't have any specific data on. But if we look at, if we just look at the competition for the different contracts between them, food service seems to be more attractive than the retail. Because the thing is, in the late 90s, with the growth of Walmart's whole shtick was, wringing efficiencies out of the supply chain. That sounds good from a retailer's perspective, not good from a farmer perspective. So, we were dealing with, I do a lot of work with the potato industry, and we were looking at contracts for potatoes out of Colorado to Walmart, 20% lower than what they would get in any other channel. So it's like grower prices for these contracts to the big retailers are rock bottom low, but farmers compete for these contracts, and they're a good thing to have because they are they're a constant market. They allow them to plan, they allow them to schedule their production, they allow them to get their potatoes out of storage when they want to. All those good things that most farmers don't have access to, especially in fruit and veg. It is really the Wild West relative to grain industry or dairy industry that I know better. Fruit and veg industry is cardiac. It's risk and reward. So anytime you can guarantee them, a constant contract, constant, end market for their food, they're going to take it. So that means that they're going to take a price discount for it.
Thanks very much. Again, a fairly specific one, but given your knowledge of the industry, do you have any idea of what signals producers are being given for the 21 harvest? Are people being offered contracts to reduce their amount of production? I know, again, I'm way too old, but I am on TikTok, and there's an amazing account of one of the veg producers in the Central California Valley. And I mean, they got stuck this time, and I don't know, what are people being asked to do for the future harvest in the next 6-12 months?
Right. Well, okay. There's a couple points to say on that. Number one, um, growers, fruit and vegetable growers, rarely plan any more than just that. Long-term planning to fruit and vegetable growers is 6 to 12 months. If you look at tomatoes that turn around every 90 days, they are turning these things pretty fast. What they're being asked is the signals they're getting from the supply chains. And what they're seeing from retailers is, bring it on, because retail demand is back to where it was before. In terms of the food service, the story we're getting down here is that it's ramping back up. The latest numbers I saw was that aggregate bookings or aggregate, restaurant demand is back up to like early 30s, 31, 32% of what it was before. And again, back to the whole sort of Wild West theme too, is that if these people are planning out for, their 6-12 months, they're going to keep planting. This is something they want to get a hold of. And there's the Packer is the big trade rag for the California fruit and veg industry, and they sponsor seminars all the time on what's going on with respect to COVID, and all the signals we're getting through those seminars. It's full steam ahead. Keep planting. Fence row to fence row.
I know you've touched on this in your talk, but I don't know if there's anything that you want to expand upon. There was a question again around just all aspects of labor and automation. Will this cause just continued focus on automation in your view?
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, that's a huge theme too, and also working on a manuscript on that. Dealing with working with, in the Phoenix Metro is the largest organic greens grower in the United States. So they deal with upwards of 1,000 H2A workers a year. And their biggest issue is not necessarily just getting, volumes of younger people across the border every year. It's their older people who are semi-skilled that are aging out of those jobs that they would otherwise, do, and then train people up. These people are in their 50s and 60s, and they're, getting too old to come across, want to spend more time with their families in Mexico. So they're kind of aging out of driving tractors and running the machines. So there is absolutely a full-on push to mechanize most of those jobs, harvesting. There's some that are going to be very hard to mechanize, soft fruit harvesting, table tomato harvesting is another one, but it's absolutely amazing some of the robotics and some of the machines that they're developing for harvesting things like romaine lettuce and things like that you wouldn't think would be mechanizable, if that's a word. There's a full-on push to mechanize labor, mechanize fruit and veg ag in California.
A few people were I think you caught their attention with that slide about supply chains of some of the major retailers. And I'll use the word that the questioner used was there mismanagement of inventories? Or maybe the broader question, how are inventories going to be managed in the future? Because, I know these people have it down to,
right.
Just-in-time, second timing. How's that going to play out in the future around inventories?
Right. Excellent question. And I was thinking about digging into the more strategic implications of that slide, but for lack of time kind of moved on. So I'm glad you asked that question. There's also a lot of discussion that those top retailers on that slide are the smartest people in the room. So there's a theory that lack of inventory performance may look bad, but it's strategic lack of inventory performance. What they did, if you've got a store that has 30,000 SKUs, stock keeping units in it, and you've got 100 workers in that store, are you going to have them stocking the things that don't move very quickly? No. You're going to have them turning the things that people are coming in and buying all the time. So they're going to be pushing out those things that they need to get from the back to the front, maintaining those facings for the things that they churn, and they're going to leave the rest of them. So there's a lot of discussion over whether or not that the empty shelves were a strategic thing. It's a labor allocation tactic on the part of these retailers, and I know that these people are smart, and I know a lot of them, and I don't believe that was a mistake.
So some of these were a little more specific around certain information. We're just going to wander into the philosophical for a moment or two here. A number of our participants today talked about, is this experience of COVID going to change our awareness of food systems? I'm assuming the assumption is that citizens generally don't think about this in some parts of the world or in some economic
Absolutely.
classes. What's your view on how that's going to change for
Absolutely.
citizens?
No, absolutely. I did an interview with NBC News last week, and that was exactly the theme, is that, that there's, silver lining to everything, right? And I think the silver lining to this one is that people are going to take food seriously. People, your average person really wouldn't know what goes on in a slaughterhouse unless they read The Jungle. Um, and that was 100 years ago. But that people are going to be very conscious of where their food comes from. They're not going to take their supply of fresh food for granted. I think that's a very good thing that's going to come out of all this.
Maybe just as I've asked now about citizens, how are governments going to react to the same situation around policies, regulation? Again, are we going to see a lot more interest in this sector than we have experienced up to now? Or how do you see that playing out over the next 2 or 3 years?
Right. Yeah. I hope they don't. Honestly, that's the last thing we need is more sort of government programs to come in and stand in the way. Other than getting out of the way in terms of immigration and down here passing reforms that it's been 30, almost 40 years in coming. They need to get that done, and that's echoing what the big lobby groups from the fresh fruit and vegetable industry. They're all saying this exactly the same thing. you know, it's crazy politically. If you look at some of the support money that's being thrown at the fresh fruit and vegetable industry, there's 1.2 billion to the farmers to families program. It's awesome that they're doing that. As a stopgap measure to make use of the waste. That's fine. But there's also, every day in the Packer, there's stories about how there was, sweetheart contracts to get the initial allotments of money for the program. How a lot of it's being wasted. How it's being directed to companies that don't actually have cooling warehousing facilities. They got in because they have a better lawyer that was able to file the paper in the first instance. If you take all of the data that I showed and you multiply price times quantity across all those commodities and add it up, it's almost the same as what it was before. Meantime, we're throwing $2.1 billion, especially crop growers in the United States in terms of support. Hopefully there's nobody from USDA on this call, but, I hate to see taxpayer money wasted. Then again, with $2 trillion worth of surplus, what's 2.1 billion, right?
You are correct. We've touched on various aspects of this, but it certainly has been a recurring theme. So I'm just going to maybe cover it again. What's your view on countries being self-sufficient in fruits and vegetables? The question was asked in the context of Canada, but I know we have people from across the world. I saw in The Economist yesterday, people are talking about some hybrid of sort of reshoring, manufacturing writ large versus the usual globalization. If you were asked by an elected official in the countries that our participants are representing, what advice would you give them about that self-sufficiency of fruit and veg?
Right. Well, the market's driving a lot of that, right? We talked about the local food mood and things like that. So that's one thing you're not going to stop. There is going to be a lot more, you see a lot of people, even on Facebook, growing their own gardens for the first time and things like that. So there is going to be a real retrenchment to, to growing local food and things like that. It's not something that policy is going to do. It's not something that governments are going to do. But in terms of supply chains, again, echoing my comment about global value chains before, that's something that, offshoring, imports of produce and things like that, until we start developing genetically engineering a banana plant that can grow in the United States, bananas are the single most popular produce item sold in the stores down here, and we can't grow them domestically. So that's one thing that you're not going to be able to, destroy the global value chain for is bananas. And that's just one example of a myriad of different commodities that just simply can't be grown in certain places. There's a lot of interest in vertical agriculture, I'm sure in Canada as much as there is down here, and a lot of capital being thrown at it. So on the edges, there's going to be innovations that do end up at the same place, right? This reshoring thing, local self-sufficiency and such, it's going on. But as a sweeping generalization to say that, we can become self-sufficient in fruit and veg, no, we're not going to, and nor do we want to. You think back to, back when you used to be able to get grapes for 4 months of the year, 5 months of the year, cherries, maybe a month of the year kind of thing, depending on when they harvested them out in the Okanagan, kind of idea. In the mid 90s, we started to look for global sources of product just because people had a 24/7, 365 demand for grapes and things like that. So American, Canadian, a lot of it's Canadian, Oppenheimer Group out of Vancouver, invested in South America, realizing, that taking advantage of the spherical nature of the earth, right, is that we're going to grow things in the Southern Hemisphere, import it back to Canada and the US in the off season. And lo and behold, what did they find? But the average consumption of certain things like grapes, for instance, increased over and above what it would have been had they just imported the same amount that consumers were consuming in the summer. Meaning that if you get a certain produce item, there's so many in the store. If you get a produce item habitually in consumer shopping baskets, they're going to consume more on an every week sort of basis. So that was the genius behind a lot of the capital going down to Chile and setting up. If you've ever been to Chile, it's amazing. It's like a long, skinny, tilted California. And, they grow everything under the sun down there. And a lot of that is American money, bringing it back to, the largest consumer market for fruit and veg in the world. And, we're not going to be able to grow a lot of that stuff in the winter, even in the United States. So there's always going to be demand for offshore products.
For some reason, during my time in that part of the world, I was always focusing on a particular value-added product that happened to be fermentable from one of those fruits.
I knew where you're going with that, right?
I take your point. A number of people ask this question. So just as I asked you about giving advice to an elected official, if someone wanted to get into the fruit and vegetable business, and we've already talked sort of about, local production, greenhouses, organic, what advice would you give to that person? And there's a little kicker to this. How have the fruit and vegetable industry, have producers contracted over the years? Have they expanded? So just kind of that whole piece, what advice would you give in sort of the background?
Okay, advice, forget about it. Number two.
Wait, I see all the participants leaving at this very moment.
No, number two, know a banker. Land values in the and if we just focus on California for a second, there's fruit and veg throughout the whole United States, don't get me wrong, but California is kind of the epicenter. And land values in California are absolutely out of sight. So to start up a farm would be, you would have to have an independent source of money to come in and set it up. The capital requirements for a beginning farmer in the fruit and vegetable industry would be absolutely insurmountable. That said, there has been a lot of concentration. The farms are getting bigger, just like they are everywhere. But that means that some of these farms are, 20, 25, 30,000 acres of, super high value agriculture. So, these are not small family farms that do fruit and veg anymore, and that was a dynamic that played out in the late 90s, early 2000s. Consolidation in fruit and veg is massive, and there's big farms.
I should have included this. I missed it sort of in that policy piece, but there have been a couple of questions, and I'm certainly interested in, we know people in particular economic classes, it's more difficult, right? In Canada, I think it's somewhere between 9 and 11% of the disposable income that's spent on food. For other economic classes, it's 35%, and usually fruit and veg is one of those parts of the diet that is not used. It represents itself so much in the food guide here in Canada, and I know in the US as well. How does not necessarily the industry, but how as we as participants, how do we make sure that people actually have that safe, nutritious diet that includes fruit and vegetables? I think you've done a bit of work on this, but what's your view of how all citizens can have that healthy, nutritious diet that includes these groups?
Right. Yeah, that's an excellent question. And there's a couple responses to that one. Number one, from a policy perspective, the Farmers to Families food box program, going through food banks is an awesome sort of system. I've done a lot of research on food banks, and it's amazing that a lot of the academic research comes from Canada. And you think about why that's the case. Down here, we've got the food stamp program, it has since, it started actually back in the 40s, but it didn't become a federal program until the 60s. But that is kind of our safety net with respect to food, I guess. But in Canada, we don't have a food stamp program per se. So the food pantry system, the food bank system is arguably more developed in Canada than it is even in the United States. That said, a lot of my friends do more work on food insecurity and food security than I do. And the mantra that they always use and always tell me is that it's all about prices. The argument is that if fruit and veg can be low price, then people will buy it in some form or other. You can go to Whole Foods and you can pay, $4 a pound for your apples if you want to, but there is a lot of avenues for obtaining fresh produce at reasonable prices. So price should not be the kind of obstacle that people think it is. We're working with a really cool organization right now called Borderlands. Long story, but the major place for importing 45% of all the fresh produce that comes from Mexico goes through Nogales, Mexico, Nogales, Arizona. Same city name, other side of the border. And then it goes to warehouses in Rio Rico, which is about 25 miles north of the border. That's where the big retailers and formerly the food service distributors would go down and pick up their produce, decide whether they're going to take a certain shipment, et cetera. 300 to 400 million pounds of fresh produce is left in Rio Rico every year based on rejected contracts. So Borderlands is a voluntary organization that loads up semi-trucks of this stuff, brings it up to the Tucson and Phoenix metro, and has farmers markets every Saturday morning in like churches and schools and things like that. You can get a 70-pound bag of produce for $10. And so there's lineups at this place. It's the most awesome organization ever. But it is, an indicator that there really is a demand for fresh produce among people who don't have the willingness or the ability to pay for Whole Foods fresh produce, or even, Safeways, Walmart, top quality retail value produce.
That's a great story. I have a minute left. I can feel Brent and the team probably making sure that I actually have the time frame so we can get people away safely. But I have to ask the last 30-second answer question. How do you think this is going to impact undergraduate and graduate students and others that might want to come in, get involved in the agriculture and food sectors that maybe never thought about this before?
Wow, that's a great question too. Again, I think it goes back to that whole sensitivity question. We are an agribusiness program within a business school. And we look at the finance program that has 1,000 kids. There's 16,000 kids in the whole WP Carey school. And, we have a couple hundred, and that's because, food is just not top of mind, traditionally not top of mind. We get people who maybe work in food service, work in food retailing, and know how important it is. But to your average person going to school, the default is to take a finance, marketing, management degree in business school, et cetera, maybe even economics. But now this is going to make food front and center. I think, there's going to be a real sensitivity to, not just how important food is, but how interesting the questions are. It's kind of ghoulish to talk this way, but from an academic perspective, COVID was a gift, right? There's going to be people whose careers are made based on doing research in COVID. We've got a special issue of the AJE coming out. Well, it's a virtual issue coming out in the fall. It's going to be nothing about COVID. And, there's going to be COVID direct studies, but there's also going to be COVID enabling study. The best exogenous identifying event ever is a pandemic. So there is going to be, an explosion of studies. So that gets to the point where there's going to be lots of ideas. There's going to be lots of opportunities. There's going to be lots of questions that need to be figured out because of COVID.
Excellent answer. And no, I don't necessarily want people that there will be a headline coming out of this saying the pandemic has been fantastic. But we take your point. If I could just do the final wrap up from our side, certainly thank you, Dr. Richard. Tim, you just did a superb job. And obviously by the engagement of our participants, you've certainly delivered on what people were hoping for. I'll just remind everyone that our next session is on the contrasts in managing vulnerability with Xiaoli Fan and Sandeep Mohapatra. So please make yourselves available at the same time in the same place next week at this time. Also, that there will be a reminder that all of the questions, and they have been great, will be moved over to the discussion portal on eClass for further discussion. So I just like to thank all of you that have participated. And again, of course, to Dr. Richards, thank you for everything that you've done. We're going to keep the chat box open, I think, for some of those other discussions, and certainly, obviously, to go over to the discussion portal. And I think I'd better just ask Dr. Swallow if there's any last items that we've missed or that I should talk about.
No, you did a great job. Thanks a lot, Stan. Thank you a lot, Tim Richards, for a fascinating presentation, and amazing to see you handle all those questions, kind of in rapid fire format, and look forward to it's interesting your last point about the new questions. I think it's really interesting. I think that for a lot of the people who have joined a course like this across the world, they're thinking about those questions now. How do I get into those? So thanks for giving us some insight into that. And now I just overall just say to the class, good job, class. So we're coming back next week. Will be we have been able to circle the world quite a bit in this class so far. So we had an African presentation. And I think next week we'll also get a Latin America presentation in the last session. But next time, especially, we're thinking about alternative kind of contrasting situations in the India and China cases. So I welcome you to that one. And we will sign off in just a minute or two.
Very good. And remember, hashtag COVID agriculture if you want to do a little amplification on Twitter. Thank you again. Thank you, Dr. Richards. Have a great morning, evening, night.
Thank you.